This is the Cato Daily Podcast for Wednesday, April 15th, 2020. I'm Caleb Brown. For several countries, the COVID-19 outbreak has put the government's surveillance in the mix as a potential solution to address the contacts that spread the virus. But we know from experience, government powers granted in one context often find their way to broader use in ways that more directly threaten liberty and privacy on an ongoing basis. Cato's Matthew Feeney discusses the tools of surveillance during a pandemic. Countries like Israel, like South Korea, and Apple and Google and some other tech companies have sort of hit upon surveillance as a key to dealing with this pandemic. Some of those policies are a little more invasive than others. The private ones, for example, are opt-in. So what do you make of using surveillance as a tool during this very sort of strange and difficult time?
At first glance, I think it's clear to most people why surveillance would be an interesting or useful strategy at a time like this. We are in the midst of a pandemic, and uh, the way that it spreads is person to person. And if you're in contact with someone who is COVID-19 positive, there's a chance that you'll get it. So it makes sense that if you're trying to tackle this problem, that the more information you have about who has the disease and who they've been in contact with, the more easy it will be to tackle this virus. And that I think makes sense. And I don't think I don't have many disagreements on that assessment. What you've seen around the world, though, is a varying degrees of surveillance. You've seen, for example, in China, the use of their already widespread surveillance system. You've had countries in the Western world that have discussed or used drones, for example, to help enforce a variety of the social distancing guidelines or stay at home orders. And this puts civil libertarians in an interesting position because we're used to, in a post 9/11 world, used to talking mostly about civil liberties as they're implicated in the ongoing war on terrorism and domestically the war on crime. And the strategy that many civil libertarians have deployed is to criticize not only the overuse of surveillance, but also its effectiveness. And it's certainly true that I and my colleagues at Cato and other civil libertarians have spent a lot of time pointing out that oftentimes these surveillance techniques actually aren't very efficient. And you've certainly seen a lot of discussion along those lines in the wake of the Snowden revelations. This COVID-19 pandemic, though, is interesting because I think actually you could make a case that in a situation where you have a contagious disease, the more information you have about where people are and who they've been in contact with, the easier it would be to address the public health emergency. And I think that means that civil libertarians should spend time, I think, making sure that we, similarly to the fight on terrorism, we define what it means for this crisis to be over. We push for policies that would require lawmakers to put a lot of these surveillance authorities and tools back in the box they came in once all this is over. The problem here is, though, that this crisis is a little harder to define than a war. If you're in a traditional war, you have a government or an army that surrenders, and that can mark the end of the conflict. Even in the war on terrorism, while it's certainly gone on much longer than I think any of us thought in 2001, there's nonetheless organizations you can define or talk about. Here, it's not clear exactly what it means for this health emergency to be over, and that does worry me because we have certainly infringes on civil liberties while the fight against this pandemic is ongoing.
So, put it back in the box. That is probably where a lot of people who might otherwise agree that surveillance can be a useful tool have to stop and say, well, what are the costs if we can't put it back in the box?
The costs are potentially very serious. For example, we are in a situation where we want to gather more information about where people have been and who they've been in contact with, and that's very valuable. I can see why this would be valuable in a fight against a virus, but it would also be useful for seeing who attended a certain protest or religious gathering or a gun show or people who visited an abortion clinic. This technology that people are discussing is not necessarily confined to a fight against a virus. And I do worry that while these numerous surveillance methods are deployed, that you'll have lawmakers and law enforcement officials who will look at this and think, actually, I can think of other ways in which this surveillance technology could be deployed. What's been interesting is work done by the folks at Apple and Google, who you mentioned earlier, who are trying to figure out ways that you can do contact tracing, so keeping a track of who has been in contact with who, without implicating privacy. Probably the most invasive way of doing this kind of location tracking, or certainly one of the most, is GPS tracking. There are discussions at the moment about using Bluetooth technology so that you'll be able to be informed by the technology that you've been close to someone who has tested positive, but without revealing specific identification or location information. And that's interesting, and I certainly welcome private sector attempts to figure out ways that we can inform people about their health while also keeping privacy preserved. What I do worry is that we'll use rather blunt instruments that we've seen in the past, whether that's the drones I discussed before, GPS tracking, in order to track the spread of the virus, because unfortunately that's a kind of surveillance technology that I don't think will go back in the box it came from.
Are you putting all your eggs in the basket of private enterprise solving this largely on an opt-in basis?
Well, that's
or do you view that there is some role for government here?
You've put your finger on, I think, an interesting question for classical liberals, because we can all applaud the innovations of private companies like Apple and Google, but of course they have no authority to force people to download the technology we've been discussing. Now, it's certainly true. Look, the Apple and Google certainly are the producers of the software and hardware that the vast majority of people in the United States use when they're using a mobile phone. And they could certainly say, look, here's an update, and a necessary part of the update is the downloading of this technology. But I do think it's fair to say, although I haven't looked at the specific technology in depth, I think it's fair to say that its effectiveness correlates with the number of people who use it. And that, I think, opens the door for potential government encouragement, let's put it that way. And that's potentially rather worrying. There have been debates among classical liberals about the role of government in public health. We're here in the middle of a outbreak of a virus, but this reminds me of conversations libertarians have had about vaccines, whether the government can mandate that. I think there'll be widespread disagreement, but I think even in this kind of crisis, you have seen classical liberals saying that actually there is a role. And if we are willing to say there is a role, then I think it behooves us to make sure that when the government's carrying out this action, like any other action, that it is transparent and respects civil liberties.
Matthew Feeney directs Cato's project on emerging technologies. Subscribe to the Cato Daily Podcast wherever you please, and follow us on Twitter @Cato Podcast.